Preparing for the SCS. The plan for today is, first of all, to look at the format of the exam. Secondly, we're going to talk about your role as a senior finance manager. It's important that you get into the right frame of mind and understand what's expected of you as a senior finance manager. Using the Prescene is obviously going to be crucial ahead of the exam, so you get this 25 to 30 page document, and it's important that you approach it in the right way and you're not just leaving your reading of it until the days before the exam. Students who understand the Prescene, they're comfortable with all of the information contained within, and have thought about the implications of the information included in the Prescene, meaning they have thought through potential issues that could arise based on what is included in the Prescene. Those students do well. Applying theory is an important topic because this is not a purely theoretical exam, it is a practical exam. It's not like the objective test exams where they're purely theoretical. You have to do a lot of calculations, etc. That's not the case with the case. It's all about certainly taking your theoretical know-how and applying it, but it's about applying all of your other know-how. So it's your business acumen, it's about your ability to influence and communicate well, and is about drawing on your own knowledge of the industry, for example, and considering the wider context within which your company is placed. All of that's going to be important, and there is a right way to apply theory when you use it, which we'll talk through in that section. Tying it all up then is important because when you've spent a number of weeks engaging with the material, you've studied the industry a little bit, you understand your role, you've reviewed your theory, and you've thought through a number of the most important issues, you've got a lot of information then knocking around your head. So it's going to be very, very important that you're able to tie it all up, in other words, summarize everything, so that you whittle down your list of many issues to maybe 8 to 10, 12 key issues. And we'll talk about some of the models you can use to do that. And then we'll talk about the importance of mock exam practice, which tends to be one of the big differentiators we see between those who fail and those who pass. So let's take a look at the format of the exam. A little bit of background here, and some of you may well be very aware of this, but just in case you're not, to get to the strategic level, you have either had to have passed the two previous levels, so the operational and the management level. You may even have taken the certificate level as well. Many would have received an exemption there. Some of you might have received exemptions for the operational level, and some indeed may even have received exemptions for some of the subjects at management level. But the typical case is a student that starts at the operational level and moves up through the management level to the strategic level. So you would have had to have passed the E3, P3 and F3 objective test exams before proceeding to the strategic case study exam, which represents obviously the last hurdle. Or rather the second last hurdle, because after that you have the professional requirements, professional experience requirements that you need to fill out as well. But it's the last exam really that you have to take before becoming fully CIMA qualified. So the context of the SCS tells us that the case is meant to be modern and relevant to the world of work. So it's meant to be a realistic case that's meant to reflect the kinds of problems you would be faced with as a senior finance manager in a real life organization. So it's a simulation of the real world of work. And that has important implications for the way you approach the exam. As I said, it's practical. It's not theoretical. Think of it. If you, in your own workplace, received an email from a colleague, as you so often do, asking for this piece of information or that, or help with some problem, it's highly unlikely you would respond to that email with a theoretical demonstration of some accounting standard or some management accounting theory. your boss would be quite puzzled if you were to respond in that way. They want practical responses. Certainly, you would draw on your theoretical know-how, but it would be very, very practical, your response most likely. And the SCS exam is just the same. So the structure of the case study, first of all, you get a Prescene document, a dossier of realistic business information of about 25 to 30 pages, about 7 weeks before the exam. And it's important to mention that the exam itself can come in one of 5 versions. So CIMA actually creates 5 variants or 5 versions in the exam week. And some of these versions can be a little trickier than some of the others, but CIMA actually takes that into account, and they will mark students who took the tougher exams a little bit less harshly than the students that took the easier exams. But there won't be a huge amount of variation in terms of difficulty, and in any case, often difficulty is quite subjective. So what one student finds easy, another student would find difficult, and vice versa. So there's been a slight change from the 2015 old syllabus that CIMA had compared to the 2019 syllabus, in that while there are still 4 exam windows, 4 opportunities to sit a case study exam in February, in May, in August and November, this time with the new syllabus, there are only going to be 2 cases per year. So that means 2 Prescene documents. So 1 Prescene document will serve 2 exam windows. So the upcoming May window, for example, there would be 1 case for that, and the same case will be covered in the August exam. Then for November and February, there will be 1 case for both of those. So there'll be the same case for both November and February. So that makes things a little bit easier, that if you were to sit the exam in May, for example, and fail, then you would have the same case that you're covering for August. So it would be a little bit easier. Whereas in the past, CIMA had a different case for each window. So within each exam variant, within each of these 5 exam variants, there are timed sections with tasks for the candidate to complete, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail now. It's important to point out that just like the objective test exam, the case study exam is a computer-based assessment. But unlike the objective test exam, it is marked by a human being. You might recall from your objective test exams that straight away after the exam, you are given a pass or fail provisional mark. That's not the case with the case study. What happens is you need to wait, unfortunately, 5 or 6 weeks before you receive a mark. This is a 3-hour exam. It will have 3 sections, and each section lasts an hour. Now that sounds like loads of time, but almost all students we talk to, and we've talked to many over the years, tells us that this is a very time-pressured exam. So you need to manage your time well, and we'll talk a little bit about how you can do that in a while. There's a 15-minute tutorial at the start leading you through the kinds of windows you'll be presented with once you start the exam, and we'll look at some of those elements in a couple of slides' time, so they're less of a surprise on the exam day. So the result that you receive in the weeks after your exam comprises of 3 elements. First of all, a high-level pass or fail grade. Then you'll get detail in the form of a scaled score from 0 to 150, with 80 representing a pass mark. And then you'll get feedback on performance according to each core activity. The core activity is a new concept for the 2019 syllabus. Some of you who took exams under the old syllabus would remember CIMA had something called competencies. So they were the technical, business, leadership and people skills that you had to demonstrate proficiency in if you wanted to receive a pass. And I think CIMA has done well to actually do away with those in the 2019 syllabus, because students were overly concerned with hitting their targets for each of the skill sets, and we were always telling them, look, don't worry about that, just concentrate on identifying what you've been asked and responding to what you've been asked. And in doing so, you will have covered the competencies in doing so. So I think they were a distraction, and what CIMA has done is just kind of cooked those skill sets into the core activities that they test. And the core activities we will discuss in a few slides' time. Going back to that scaled score, so 0 to 150, 80 representing a pass mark. And what CIMA does first of all is they take your script and they mark it out of 100. Okay, and then they consider how difficult the script was. Remember what I said before, the CIMA releases 5 versions of the exam. They know that some versions will be a little bit trickier than others, so they will mark those more leniently. And the way they do that then is they take your raw score and they scale it then according to that 0 to 150. And they might find with some of the borderline cases for the difficult exams, they would actually bump them up to a pass. Whereas with the easier scripts, if you had someone right on the edge, they might actually fail that person if they ascertain that the variant was actually easier. But you don't need to obsess too much about that. Again, it's all about just having a common sense approach to your preparation, and indeed having a solid approach to the exam on the day itself, and not to be obsessing about core activities or scaled scores or anything like that. You kind of lose track of what's important then. It's all about identifying what you've been asked and just addressing what you've been asked. And that sounds very simple, but you would be amazed at how often the CIMA examiner in the post-exam reports flags up as the most common issue the fact that students did not identify what they were being asked and did not, as a result, respond to what was being asked. So students kind of, I think they're in such a hurry often and so time pressured as a result of not having done enough mock exam practice, for example, that they identify irrelevant issues. And then if you identify obviously the wrong thing, you're not going to have the right answer. Often as well, you'll have students who kind of prepare answers in advance because there are certain topics will come up, and they're just determined to work those prepared answers in. And they see a question and they kind of think, well, yeah, it's not exactly the question I wanted, but it's kind of the question I wanted. And then they just jam their answer in that they prepared in advance. And well, the examiner sees that a mile coming. It's another big complaint of examiners, that students prepare answers in advance of the exam and they just are forcing their answers into a script, regardless of whether they are applicable to the question they've been asked or not. So don't fall into those traps. So let's look at the core activities. First of all, the core activities are job tasks that you are expected to perform capably as a senior finance manager. You know, that's all you really need to realize there. There isn't much more to it. So what CIMA has done is offered guidance on the activities they expect you to demonstrate capability in. So first of all, developing business strategies. So that accounts for 15 to 25% of the marks that CIMA allocates to the strategic case study exam. The second area is evaluating business ecosystems and business environments. Again, 15 to 25% of the marks allocated. The next core activity is recommending financing strategies, and that accounts for the same percentage of marks. Evaluating and mitigating risks accounts again for 15 to 25% of the marks. And recommending and maintaining a sound control environment represents 15 to 25% of the marks. So, 5 big areas. And it's tempting when you look at these to think, CIMA's really done us a favor here. They've reduced the number of things that I need to focus on. They have flagged up, these 5 things. They're quite narrow, and I can kind of just select a couple of things that I prepare in advance, theoretically, and I'm set for the exam. And that would be an error, unfortunately, because when you actually dig into the detail of what's behind these core activities, you'll see how broad they actually are. And they end up encapsulating basically all of your theory across E3, F3 and P3, unfortunately. So CIMA is not really doing you many favours. In the past, CIMA would typically test anything and everything on the day of the exam under the old syllabus, and I think that will continue to be the case. So we'll take a look at how wide-ranging any one of these core activities can actually be on the next slide. So this is a snippet taken from CIMA's blueprint for the strategic level. And in the blueprint, they run through the 5 core activities we've just identified, and they outline in detail the kinds of things you're expected to do and know in relation to each core activity. So let's take a look at the first one, develop business strategy. Sounds simple. And when you get into the detail, you'll see how wide-ranging this actually is, because they're talking, first of all, about strategic options, digital and otherwise. So digital is like the buzzword for CIMA under the new syllabus. The enterprise pillar is the one that has drastically changed. So that is E1, E2, E3. And the financial pillar and the performance pillar, which is your financial accounting and management accounting pillars, they have not changed very much. So it's the enterprise pillars that have. And the enterprise pillars really focus on all things technological and all things digital. So you're seeing plenty of mention about digital technologies in this particular section. So strategic options, digital and otherwise relates to E3. Acquisitions and divestment would relate to F3. Opportunities and threats arising from digital technologies and probably the risks associated with digital technologies that your company would have, very much part of P3, managing risk. So you can see there that that one core activity, while it started out as seeming pretty straightforward, has just covered all 3 objective test areas, and it's the same for the other 4 core activities. So seems not really narrowing things down with these core activities, very, very broad, as I said. So once you come into the exam, you'll have a 15-minute tutorial, and I will lead you through these windows, or windows that are very similar to them. So to reduce the element of surprise, if you've never looked at this before, this is what it would look like. So on the day of the exam, you'll be presented at the start with an overview of the sections, so 3 sections, with the number of tasks you have and the time for each section, which will be 60 minutes per section. Now, what's new in the 2019 syllabus, and I think it's very useful, is that CIMA has allocated a time breakdown for each task in the instructions. So that's very useful, because previously under the old syllabus, CIMA would tell you that there were 60 minutes for a particular section. They would assign 2 tasks or 2 questions in that section, and they wouldn't indicate that one or other of the tasks could account for more marks or less. Very often the split would be even between 2 tasks, for example, where you would have 2 tasks and 50% of the marks would be allocated to task 1 and 50% of the marks would be allocated to task 2. Fine. But sometimes CIMA would have a section where there would be 2 tasks, and one of the tasks would account for 70% of the marks, and another would account for 30% of the marks, and the student was blind to that fact. So how would the student know that? They couldn't, obviously, and quite reasonably, the student would allocate half of their time to the first task and half of their time to the second, and then as a result, they would end up writing less than they should have for the first task. So that wasn't very fair, I think. So CIMA has actually identified where there are more marks going for one task or another. So you can see there in section 3, there are 3 tasks, whereas previously a student might have been tempted to allocate equal time to tasks A, B, and C there. you can see that would have obviously been an error, because what CIMA has done here is allocated 60% of the marks to task A. So much more of your time would need to be dedicated to task A than to tasks B and C. So be careful with that and bear that in mind. When you see that at the start, pay attention to it and understand that you as a student need to bias the amount of time you spend based on the way CIMA has allocated marks. So once you get into the exam, you'll have a scenario, usually in the form of an email or a report or an article. And that scenario will set the scene for the questions that are about to follow. So often you'll get an email from a boss, for example, asking for your help with something. It's important also to mention that you do have access to the Prescene document at any stage if you want to pull it up. It's a clean copy of the Prescene document. And it's something that is obviously a comfort, because if you forget something, you can jump back to the Prescene. However, we always recommend to students that they have covered the Prescene a number of times and they understand it very well, so that they know it well enough that they don't have to jump back and forth between the exam question and the Prescene document on the day of the exam. Remember, this is a very time-pressured exam. And if you're jumping back and forth between the Prescene document and the exam questions, you're going to lose a lot of valuable time. Speaking of time, there will be a timer counting down your time in the top right corner. You don't need to obsess over it, but certainly every 5 to 10 minutes you need to be glancing at it to ensure that you're on track. Just something to quickly mention, you might have noticed that this extract is taken from the management case study. The previous slide was taken from a strategic case study. You don't need to worry about that, because the same elements are in place for the operational management and strategic case studies. So the time changes for sure, because with the management and operational case studies, it's 45 minutes per section. But for the strategic case study, it's 60 minutes, but pretty much everything else is similar. Okay, so the next slide then, reference materials. Often an email or a trigger or a scenario will have attachments in the form of reference materials. So these will often be tables of financial statement figures or financial ratios. They might be budget figures versus actuals, or some such thing. And you would be expected often to comment on those figures and those tables, and often it's not so much that you would have to do detailed calculations so much as interpret figures. It's often useful as well to skim down to the end of a particular scenario, because often that's where the questions are actually asked. You'll often notice that they come in bullet point format, are followed by question marks. So they're some of the obvious clues as to this is what I'm being asked. And it's very, very important that you quickly identify what exactly am I being asked here, because you'll get a scenario with lots and lots of padding and some irrelevant information, and rather than working down through all of that information first without knowing what you're actually being asked, it's better first to identify what you're being asked and then go back and work down through all of that information. Why? Because you're priming your brain then. You have identified what is important and what you're being asked. And if you have understood that, then you can work through the information in a sensible way, looking out and sifting through the information to find information that is in accordance with the task you've been set. Okay, here's an example of an exhibit or an attachment that you could get. So this is the reference materials here. You'll see there's both a ratio section and an article attached. So in the ratio section, it seems to be a comparison between 3 different companies. Possibly one of the companies is yours and the other 2 are rival companies. So you've got ratios, you've got financial performance figures here, and you might have a non-finance person coming with this table of figures to you and asking you to comment sensibly on them, to interpret the figures for him or her. And you would also be expected to flag up any inconsistencies or flawed assumptions, and that would particularly be the case if it's a non-finance person who's coming with a set of figures, for example. They may well have made a false assumption, and you as a finance person would be expected to spot that flawed assumption. So that's an example of the kind of theoretical engagement that you might need to opt for on the day of the exam. So it's not so much a case of you taking out your pen and, doing intricate calculations. That's what would happen in the objective test exam. With the case, it's a different beast. And then you have an answer screen. So in the answer screen, you've got a word processing type piece of software where you type your answer in. So that is the first section done on the format of the exam, the background of the exam. Now we're going to take a look at your role as a senior finance manager and understanding that role, because it has important implications for the way that you respond to questions. So, it's crucial that you play the part of a senior finance manager. And the little diagram on the left there with the hierarchy, with possibly the CEO at the top, the senior managers on the second rung, maybe a couple of managers as well, and probably the lowly finance officers on the bottom rung. So you've worked your way up through the levels. Well done. You would have been a lowly finance officer at the operational case study level. For the management level, you were a middle manager, and now you're a senior manager, and you're going to be interacting with people at the very top of the organization. So that has implications for the way that you approach the exam. First of all, you have strategic responsibilities now, whereas at the operational level, it was all about advising middle managers mostly and focusing on day-to-day issues. Now it's all about determining the long-term strategy of the business with the most senior people at the company. So you're going to be interacting with the CEO, the CFO, members of the board, etc. So you're going to have to influence them. You're going to have to get your point across. So communication skills are hugely important at this level. You're also expected to consider the wider context within which your business is operating. You need to bear in mind, in accordance with Mendelow's matrix, which you would have come across in your enterprise studies, multiple stakeholders. So you're not just considering your own narrow interests as a company. You need to get your head up and consider competitors. You need to consider the regulatory environment. You need to consider the societal impact of your business. So it might be that, especially nowadays when everyone is concerned about the environment, are there any negative environmental externalities that are affecting the community in which your company is located? And how could you mitigate some of those risks for the wider community? So all of that's important, thinking of the wider context in which your business is operating. So you're expected to give advice that is not just in line with the narrow interests, commercial interests of your organization, but considers other stakeholders too. And think about who you're speaking to. Are you engaging with the CEO, the CFO? Are you engaging with a member of the board who is a non-finance expert, for example? If that was the case, you would need to unpack certain technical terminology that they might not be familiar with. Whereas if you're speaking with the CFO, you can assume that they understand what you're talking about when you use some of the jargon associated with mergers and acquisitions or something like that. So, because you have a strategic responsibility now, you're thinking about the long term. Whereas at the operational level, you're working under a very short time frame, so it's 1 to 3 months, maybe 6 months. Now you're talking about the long term, so 3 to 5 years. So you're going to be making recommendations that play out over that time horizon. So this will relate to the kinds of products and services that the company offers over that time period. Whether the company should be making acquisitions to break into new markets or to enter new product categories, for example. The technologies and the capital investment associated with the technologies that might take the company to the next level. So as well, you need to consider the associated risks with some of those capital expenditures and putting in place long-term financing for all of the above. So that's what it means to think about the long-term time horizon here. You need to give ethical advice as well. So especially at the strategic level, it's very, very important that you are not just giving advice that focuses on the commercial interests of the organization, but is also ethically sound. Do the right thing. CIMA loves to see students make use of the CIMA Code of Ethics and the 5 principles contained within when they're faced with an ethical issue. So make use of that framework. So going further then, and understanding your role as a senior finance manager. This is again taken from the strategic blueprint that CIMA published for the new syllabus. And there they outline what it is you need to do to get into the frame of mind as a senior finance manager. And you're going to see some of the terms I've already flagged up. So developing the business strategy, considering the ecosystem of the organization, so beyond just the narrow interests of the organization, risk management over the long term, and considering especially technological risks in the form of cyber risks, which is a new area of the P3 syllabus, raising financing for the long term, which we've talked about, making the business case for digitization, so digital, all things digital, E3. Understanding how capital markets operate, so understanding how to put in place that long-term financing for your business. Corporate governance is important. Being a good corporate citizen, again, that would tie into what I said earlier on about, understanding the societal impact of your activities as a business. Internal and external stakeholders need to be considered. The control environment that your company has is important. So thinking about internal audit, for example, again, part of P3, and adhering at all times to high standards of professionalism and ethics. So CIMA wants you to do the right thing. So this is all about mindset. It's interesting in this blueprint, the number of times that CIMA actually mentions mindset. And that indicates to me that they expect you to go beyond raw technical know-how to consider your communication skills, how you influence the top people at the company, for example, how you sensibly understand the wider context. Are you capable of that? Are you capable of going beyond just making recommendations that work in your company's favor? Are you considerate of other stakeholders? Are you digitally savvy? So that relates to E3, understanding those technologies. If you're someone who's taken E3 under the old syllabus, you do need to be careful because E3 has changed quite a lot. So you need to brush up on the theory that's covered in the new E3 2019 syllabus. And being ethically aware. So next up, we have the Prescene itself. Okay, so this is a 25 to 30 page document that you receive 6 to 7 weeks before your exam. And how you engage with this document will determine to a large extent how you do on the day of the exam. So it's worth reflecting first of all on the purpose of the document itself. This is meant to be a realistic dossier of information relating to your fictional business. So this will be a fictional business that you work at, but very much modelled on real-world companies. And what the document does is it allows you to understand not just your own business, but your role within the business, the wider context within which your business is placed. So it'll undoubtedly talk about competitors, it'll talk about the industry itself and some of the trends that are affecting the industry, and some of the big issues facing the business. So often, CIMA will flag up some of these big issues in the articles towards the end of any Prescene document. So it's worth paying particular attention to those articles, because often they flag up trends that are problems that are facing the industry, or opportunities that you could take advantage of. So watch out for them, because often CIMA will build on some of those issues in the exam itself. And the document will always include financial statements for both your company and often for rivals. So it's worth going through those financial statements in detail, and coming up with ratio analysis, comparing one year to the next, comparing the figures between rivals, etc. And the articles, as I said, are important. Often you'll have budgeting information there, which might be compared to actuals, for example, on the day of the exam. And there'll be lots of competitor information as well. So this is the kind of information you get in a Prescene document. So what do you actually do with this? What's a sensible way to approach how you engage with this document? First of all, it's important that you do engage with the document and you don't just leave it to the last minute. You need to really, engage with the document earlier on and let it sit. Because things will be occurring to you all the time. And as I said before, it's important that you have the right mindset. You need to get in the mindset of a senior finance manager who actually works at this business. So don't expect to be able to do that if you're reading the document for the first time 2 days before the exam. Understand the company. So understand the key affairs, its products, its services, some of the trends that are affecting it or likely to affect it in the near future. The financial analysis of both the company and the competitors themselves, the competitors as well. Secondly, a little bit of industry research is a good thing. I know some people say, well, you have some industry information in the Prescene itself. You don't really need to go beyond that, and that's a mistake. You definitely should be reading up on the industry. If you understand the wider industry, if you understand some of the real-life trends that are playing out in the industry, then you undoubtedly have an advantage because you understand then the wider context. You can make sensible recommendations, and often you can flag up potential exam issues. CIMA will often be very well aware of what's going on in the industry, of the company that they have for the Prescene, and they will pull out pertinent industry issues and work them into the exam. So it's definitely worth going beyond what's contained in the Prescene document and doing a little bit of industry research yourself. You don't need to go down the rabbit hole and read, hundreds and thousands of pages on the industry. You just need to keep your eyes open, read newspaper articles relating to the industry, look at industry articles and magazines, talk to people perhaps who work in the industry, and that's definitely all useful. So approaching the Prescene then, we would suggest the following. The first 1 or 2 read-throughs should involve you just skimming. Okay, so you just want to get a feel for what's going on. You're quickly working through the document, looking at the headings, you're looking at the difference, you're noting the different sections, the way it's broken up, and getting a feel for what's going on, the kinds of products and services that the company offers, that kind of thing. With the next reading, which might be your second or even third reading, you want to take a little bit more time, and you want to highlight the key terms only. We notice so often with students, they go crazy with the highlighter, so they highlight 80% of the text in a Prescene document. And what you're telling your brain in that instance is everything's important. And you may as well be telling it that your brain nothing is important if you've highlighted 80% of the text. The point of highlighting is that you are pulling out the most pertinent, the most important issues. So you only want to highlight the bare minimum. And when you do that, you tell your brain, this is important, and this is important, and the rest is less important. The next read-through would involve even going slower. So here you're analysing in great detail. You're going paragraph by paragraph, and you're making notes. You're thinking about the implications of the information. You're going beyond what's written down, And you're thinking, okay, they've included that. Why? What could potentially lead on from this on the day of the exam? You're using your imagination here. Okay, you're dreaming up potential problems, potential opportunities that come from what's included in the document. So make notes, generate ideas, and relate the ideas to key theories from E3, F3, and P3. And when you've done all of that, and that will take time, but when you've done all of that, you're going to have a lot of stuff knocking around your head, as I said before. And what you need to do then is to try to summarize things with a few key models. So SWOT analysis, for example, is a good idea. We'll talk about that in a few slides' time. But there are other models that you can use. And what these models do is they allow you to kind of step back from this massive detail to get a bigger picture of the key things. And you'll often see when you use a number of models that things start repeating, so that you can further reduce the number of important things. And then you're left with sort of 8 to 12 maybe key issues. And then you're super focused on what is really essential. And what you'll find then is if you've done your homework and you've done that well, that CIMA will often build on these key issues. They'll have identified the same ones very often. Now, having said that, the next point is important. You want to avoid second-guessing the examiner. Do not dedicate too much time to guessing what exactly is going to come up on the day of the exam. Too many students, we've seen in the past, become very, very attached to 2 or 3 issues that they've identified. And they think, this is definitely being asked. And this is the detailed answer I'm going to come up with on the day of the exam. And then they're very attached to that. They go into the exam and they find, well, this isn't being tested. Surprise, surprise, CIMA is testing, all these other things. And this is an exam in which CIMA does and can test any one of a number of things, thousands of things they could test. So that is not a good approach. What you do want to do, however, is to identify lots and lots of scenarios, lots and lots of ideas, generate plenty of ideas, as I said, when you're working through the Prescene, and kind of have a loose attachment to the ideas that you generate, thinking, okay, if that came up, how could I approach that answer? You might jot down a couple of notes, a couple of ideas. Often you'll just generate the ideas in your own head. And it's much better to generate lots and lots of those ideas and have a loose affiliation or a loose attachment to them than to be very attached to 2 or 3 big issues you've identified and you've written up very detailed answers. So the second approach is much better. So overall, the better analysed the Prescene is, the better prepared you are and the higher your confidence can be. So the idea is that you know the Prescene document so well that on the day of the exam, you're not jumping back and forth between the Prescene itself and the questions. If you can avoid that, you have a big advantage over many students and you should be able to manage your time much more effectively. We have an image there of a famous non-accounting person, but someone who we can definitely learn from nonetheless. So I want you to think about that quote. In theory and practice are the same. In practice, they are not. And this relates to what I've been saying about the case study exam being a different beast to the objective test. The objective test is purely theoretical. And the case study is a much more practical affair, far less theoretical. So mock exam practice is crucial, and having the right mindset is important. Understanding that this is not a dry exposition of theory. It's about applying all of your know-how, not just theoretical. So to labour this point a little bit more, think of this situation. So some of you might notice the footballer on the right, a very famous football player by the name of Diego Maradona. But you could imagine another sports star, could be Roger Federer, or if you like tennis or whoever it is. And think of the way that elite athletes get to the top. They definitely don't spend their time reading up on the theory of their sport, spending most of their time doing that, and then sort of leaving the last 10% of their time to practice, to go out in the practice field or practice court and put all of that theory into practice. They heavily favour and bias practice itself. So they spend 99% of their time on the practice court or the practice field. They might do a little bit of theorising with their coach, perhaps 1 to 2% of their time. So that's the way elite athletes approach their endeavour. Same for musicians. Any of you who have played the piano or violin or whatever it is, or guitar, you will know that a very bad approach to learning an instrument is to sit and engage with music theory all day long and to spend only a little bit of time doing scales and things like that. You want to bias action, the time you spend on your instrument, and then do a little bit of theory on the side, which can help you understand the instrument, but definitely won't make you play the instrument any better. And it's similar for accountants. Accounting is very much a doing subject. So you should be weighting more time towards practice. That means mock exam practice, which is very, very important. And we see that it is perhaps the most crucial part of your preparation. I'll talk about that soon. So applying theory, how do you do it? First of all, the objective tests are for examining theory. The case asks you to apply your know-how. So you're not doing intricate calculations, you are applying what you know, and that is broader than the theory that you know. It's not a theory test, it's a practical test. You definitely do want to use theories if they're applicable. If you do use a theory, it's worth mentioning the theory, but give a very brief overview. Mention the theory you're going to use in the answer, and then 3 to 4 lines explaining what that theory is, and then just get on to applying. There are no marks gained for explaining the theory in the abstract. So once you've introduced that theory, I'm going to use the balanced scorecard here. It's quite useful. And the balanced scorecard is, and you use 3 to 4 lines to explain what it is. Then get into taking the elements of the balanced scorecard and applying it to your company and to the scenario that has come up on the day of the exam. Okay? So if instead you just work through an explanation of the balanced scorecard, the different elements, the 4 elements, 4 perspectives, what each one is, and you're not talking about it in the context of your business and the context of the questions, 0 marks. So you have to apply it. So once you've taken the theory, you've explained in 3 to 4 lines what it is, you've taken the different elements and applied them to your company, you're going to draw on supporting evidence, where from the Prescene itself, use the information you have there. Use what you know about the real-life industry if it's relevant. Use the exam exhibits themselves. This is something that so many students neglect. There is a wealth of information that CIMA provides in the tables and attachments that they include on the day of the exam, and CIMA, the examiner in the post-exam reports, is always mentioning the fact that students have loads of information there and often they don't use it. So use it. There's no excuse for not being able to write enough in the exam. You can draw on all of that information and you'll find that there isn't enough time to write everything you want to if you have the right approach. And of course, your own experience. So you might have relevant professional experience that you can draw on that experience and support your answer. So that's how you apply theory in the case study. Do make sure that your technical knowledge is up to date for those core activities. So you definitely do want to be reviewing E3, F3 and P3, but you don't want to go down the rabbit hole there. You want to quite quickly review those theories. Remember, the fact that you've come through E3, F3 and P3 demonstrates to CIMA that you are theoretically on point, that you have the technical knowledge. So why would they do another theory test? This is a different kind of test. This is much more practical. It's meant to be like the real world of work. What do we mean when we say we want to tie it all up? As I said, when you've engaged with the Prescene document, when you have generated so many ideas, you're going to be a little confused perhaps after the first few weeks of engaging with all of this information. And what you want to do then is simplify things. You want to summarize things. And there are a few key models you can use to do so. And the enterprise pillar is very much your friend here. You're going to see that a lot of these models are coming from not just E3, but E2 and E1 as well. So that means it's important to reflect on and maybe quickly review some of the theories that you came across in the operational management level, and feel free to use them and apply them on the day of the exam. CIMA assumes that you have knowledge of the prior CIMA levels. And if you can bring that information and knowledge to bear on the day of the exam, then go for it. Okay. The SWOT analysis is the first key model that you can use to summarize things very well. So you'll know that the SWOT covers the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats facing the business. Remember that the strengths and weaknesses are relating to the internal characteristics of the organization, so they're under the control of the organization. But the opportunities and threats are much more outward looking and relate to factors that the business really cannot control itself. It can just kind of position itself well to take advantage of opportunities and to mitigate threats. So remember all of that. Any recommendation that you make should ideally take advantages of the strengths and opportunities available to the company. And you want to be careful about recommendations that play into the weaknesses or expose the company to threats. So that's a really good model to sum up some of the most important issues facing the business. The next one also comes from the enterprise pillar, the PESTLE. Okay, these are the political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal issues relating to the business and its environment. So another really useful model for summarizing some of the main issues that the business is engaging with. The marketing mix, what was once known as the 4 Ps, is now extended to cover the 7 Ps. So previously it was product, price, promotion, and place, has now extended into physical evidence, people, and processes. So another really good model to understand the offering that the business has, and to understand, its promotional activities. Does it have strengths and weaknesses there? Is it present in enough places to reach the customers that it wants to reach? So a really good model as well to analyze things in a high-level kind of way. Porter's 5 Forces allows you to consider the threat of new entrants, the power of your suppliers, the power of your customers, the competition, etc. So another really useful model in tying things up. And we've another model from Michael Porter here, the value chain. Thinking not just of your own narrow value chain, but considering the value chains of suppliers, customers, etc. So the value system, the wider context within which your business is operating there, thinking of support activities and primary activities. So all of these are very useful theoretical models for summarizing things in a high-level way and identifying some of the most crucial issues facing the business. And as I said before, when you work through all of these models, you'll see that there's a lot of overlap between some of the models. So that allows you to further narrow down the crucial issues that the business is facing. So when you've used all of these models to sum up things, look for the points they have in common, pull out the points that you see in common, and you might be left with 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 issues, and pay particular attention to those 8 to 12 key issues you've identified. So now we're going to talk about practice, mock exam practice. I want to draw your attention to the image behind, because I think it's one of those cases where an image tells a story that you would take 1,000 words to tell. Look at all of those missed attempts. That's what you want to be doing before the exam. Okay? So with your mock exam attempts, it's very unlikely with your first attempt that you're going to hit the bullseye. So I cannot understand people who have not practiced any mock exams walking into the exam on the day and it being the first time they're going to write a case study exam. And that they have convinced themselves that they're going to have something like an optimal attempt here. You might have done all the preparation, you know all the theory, and again and again and again, we see students that have done a lot of preparation. They are very knowledgeable in terms of the theory, but they haven't done any mock exam practice, and with their first attempt, they're making a ton of errors. So it's as much about learning how to take the test as it is about understanding all the stuff that goes on in the Prescene, understanding the theory, etc. So you've got to be good at taking the test. And the only way to get good at it is to practice lots of tests. So you want to be making your mistakes before you go into the exam. And what we find is when we mark scripts, that we identify all the big errors with that first mock attempt. So 80% of the errors we're identifying there. And when the student gets that feedback, their second attempt is drastically improved. And they're most of the way there to getting an optimal exam script or close to it. And then over the next 2 or 3 or 4 mock exam attempts, they're fine-tuning things, but it's the first attempt really where they make most of their mistakes. Mistakes that they weren't even aware of. So you want to be making your mistakes outside the real-life exam. And by the time you get to the exam, you're getting close to an optimal attempt. So practice, practice, practice. Lots of mock exams. Many, as I hinted at, fail due to insufficient question practice. So they've all the theory in the world, they're knowledgeable students, but they have not adequately practiced mock exams. And a big part of getting your mock exam approach right is being able to manage your time well. That's crucial. So many students are caught off guard by how time pressured this exam actually is. So do mock exams under exam timing conditions. And a lot of students, and it's very understandable, with their first attempt in particular, they're nervous. That's understandable. And they want to kind of go easy on themselves. They think, I haven't done all of my preparation. I need to still review these theories. I need to work through this part of the Prescene in more detail. I need to do a bit more industry analysis. I'll give myself half an hour more and an hour more on this first attempt. And we don't recommend that. If you, do that, if you're soft on yourself, you're not pushing yourself hard enough there. And you'll be surprised on the day of the exam. So from the first attempt, do it under the same timing scenario that you would have on the day of the exam. And it'll be uncomfortable. It's meant to be uncomfortable. If it is uncomfortable, that's a good thing. And the idea is that it becomes less and less uncomfortable with each subsequent mock exam attempt. Get feedback if you can. So there are lots of tuition companies and tutors out there that can offer marking services. And VIVA does that itself. We have very experienced tutors marking mock exams, and we do a lot of that. We've seen a lot of scripts, so we know what we're looking at. We know what we're doing when we make recommendations. And it's definitely worth doing for at least one mock exam. Ideally, you would do it for 2, 3, 4, 5 exams, but definitely the first attempt, because that's where most of the problems get flagged. So you might have 70-80% of the problems identified with the first mock attempt. You take the feedback away and you apply it with your second attempt, third attempt, fourth attempt, etc. And it's definitely worth doing. Avoid the urge to question spot. What I was saying earlier on, resist the urge to think, this is definitely coming up on the day of the exam. You want to resist that temptation. And instead of being very, very, close and attached to, the issues you think you've identified, maybe 2, 3 key issues you think, these are definitely coming up, have a loose association with sort of 10, 15, 20 ideas that you've generated. Okay, How might I approach that in the day of the exam? Jot down some ideas, generate some ideas in your own head. That's good enough, okay? So there we go. The plan was to look at the format and background of the exam, to understand your role as a senior finance manager, to use the Prescene in an intelligent way, to apply theory in the right way, and to summarize everything with some key models. And we discussed the importance of mock exam practice.